the heroes will always be remembered, the best and the worst, and a few who were a bit of both, like him. Who? 10 black pellets on a scarlet field. I do not know those arms. They belonged to Criston Cole, who served the first Viserys and the second Aegon. They called him the Kingmaker. Loras Tyrell and Jaime Lannister, A Feast for Crows Chapter 16, Jaime 2. Out of all the characters from the Dance of the Dragons, I find Criston Cole truly one of the most fascinating, for one simple reason. His complicated relationship with Rhaenyra Targaryen that may or may not have happened, and how this led to him becoming a key figure for the Greens, forever known as the Kingmaker for his part in the crowning of King Aegon II. In fact, when you take a step back and look at the wider context of Westerosi history, it's Criston's kingmaking that has become his lasting legacy, to the point key characters from the main book series, such as Jaime Lannister and Arianne Martell, mainly associate him with this act. I was very surprised with how House the Dragon really minimised Criston's role in the crowning of Aegon, and gave much of the true impactful parts of it to Aemond, thus removing the most iconic part of Criston's legacy. In this video, I want to really delve into Criston's role in the crowning of Aegon, and discuss why I think the show may have changed this aspect of his character. But before we can do that, there is an issue we need to address. Here is the thing. Criston Cole is one of the characters who is most affected by the narrative structure of Fire and Blood. While part of the fictional histories tell the story of the build-up to and the Dance of the Dragons itself via several different historical accounts from differing sides of the conflict, the way this information is given to the reader allows for them to draw their own conclusions based on the sources presented. Some readers very much stick to believing one set of sources over another, as that creates a narrative they believe and enjoy the most, while others try to rationalise the conflicting sources into a muddy grey area in between. For a lot of the key players in the Dance of the Dragons, there is enough information that sources agree upon that we can form a basic idea of their character. The likes of Rhaenyra, Alicent, Aemond, Aegon, yes, it's still very surface level, but when combined with the context of their actions, we can build a picture of who they are. Sir Criston protects the princess from her enemies, but who protects the princess from Sir Criston? Alicent Hightower to the court of Viserys I Targaryen. Fire and Blood, heirs of the dragon, a question of succession. Rhaenyra is the perfect example of this phenomenon. You have accounts painting her as the wronged party, as others paint her as this mad tyrant. When you combine this with the context of her actions, she lives in this grey area where we know enough to get an idea of her character, but there is a lot of maybes and blanks up to interpretation. Within the context of Fire and Blood, I do think this style of writing really works well, but there are some characters that are harder to pin down and form a cohesive narrative for. So Criston Cole is one of them, especially when it comes to his actions in the build-up to the Dance of the Dragons. There is no functional way there can be a grey area. Thus, what narrative you believe drastically changes who Criston Cole is, and this too has an impact on his motivations for, well, kingmaking, and thus why the show may have had to take a different approach. What I want to do with this video is take a look at the accounts of Criston Cole's early life and figure out what series of events could be true, and most of all, if he should really be known as the Kingmaker for his role in the crowning of Aegon II in the first place. Surprisingly, Criston Cole's early life at court is fairly well documented, with not much in dispute or left up to the readers to determine. We know he joined the Kingsguard in 105 AC at the age of 23, but before this point we only know a fraction of his life prior. His father was the steward to House Dondarrion, and there is also a blog post by George R. R. Martin that suggests that Criston is common born, We also know that Criston was an exceptionally talented warrior. The year prior, in 104 AC, he won a melee at the tourney at Maidenpool to celebrate the ascension of King Viserys to the throne, drawing the attention of the royal court by knocking Dark Sister from the hands of Prince Daemon Targaryen with his Morning Star. He then gave the victor's laurel to the 7-year-old Princess Rhaenyra, whose favour he wore when he unhorsed Daemon Targaryen in the joust, as well as the twins Sir Aric and Sir Eric Cargill of the Kingsguard, before eventually being unhorsed by Lord Lyman Mallister. After this, Viserys indulged his young daughter by naming Criston her own personal sworn shield. So what I think is important to establish here is this is the kind of information that is objectively true in terms of the text we have access to. There is nothing and little reason to dispute these versions of events. So Criston Cole was a remarkable warrior at such a young age, especially to disarm Daemon Targaryen. It's clear to see from his skill at arms he deserved his place on the Kingsguard. Criston the Kingmaker had set brother against sister and divided the Kingsguard against itself, bringing on the terrible war the singers named The Dance of the Dragons, The Thoughts of Aris Oakhart, A Feast for Crows Chapter 13, The Soiled Knight. There is a scene in House of the Dragon Season 1 when Rhaenyra is picking the new member of the Kingsguard, where she questions whether Criston is Dornish. Given he grew up in the Dornish marches, that might explain why he might have seemed Dornish. The only thing I think we can infer from the text is maybe the reasons that Criston is such a well-rounded warrior is due to him growing up in the marches themselves, fighting Dornish raiders. But my point here is this part of Criston Cole's backstory isn't really questioned that much, and we're not really given much reason to question it. But events from 105 onwards really do start to get confusing in terms of what Criston did and did not do, and what his motivations were, all leading to the idea of him kingmaking. The reason this is so important is because depending on what version of events you believe, significantly changes why Criston is an apparent kingmaker. Something we have to make abundantly clear here at this stage is the age difference between Criston and Rhaenyra is much bigger in the books versus the TV show, and really changes the tone of their dynamic. In the show, when Rhaenyra meets Criston, she's around 14 years old. While we can't say how old Criston is in the show, I would suspect he is in his early 20s if the script for episode 1 is anything to go by. By the time she sleeps with Criston in episode 4, Rhaenyra would be around 16 to 17 years of age, with Criston now in his mid-20s. While that age gap is still not great, by A Song of Ice and Fire standards, it's not that bad. Meanwhile, in Fire and Blood, when Rhaenyra first meets Criston in 105 AC, she's 7 years of age, and Criston 23. By the year 111, when the altercation between Rhaenyra and Criston may or may not have happened, she would have been 13 and Criston nearly 30. Tonally, it really changes what Criston may or may not have done and his motivations for doing so. So I can understand why the show changed a lot of the character ages, much like Game of Thrones had to do as well. The reason why this age gap becomes so important is something we will touch upon later. The first time we really get any indication about anything romantic between Rhaenyra and Criston suggests it was Rhaenyra whom initiated it. At this time, she was very close with her uncle Daemon. He would enthrall her with tales of his journeys and battles, give her gifts, read her poems, dined with her and hawked with her, sailed with her and entertained her, praised her beauty, declaring her to be the fairest maid in the 7 kingdoms. The two began to fly together daily, racing their dragons to Dragonstone and back. Now, as is typical with Fire and Blood, we have two very different versions of what happens next. We have Grand Maester Runceter's account, which only says that Viserys and Daemon quarrelled, and that Daemon departed King's Landing to return to the Stepstones and his war. As to the cause of the quarrel, he does not speak. But Septon Eustace and Mushroom tell another tale, each different from the other, but with similarities. Septon Eustace tells us that Prince Daemon seduced Rhaenyra and claimed her maidenhood. When they were found abed by Sir Aric Cargill of the Kingsguard and brought before Viserys, Rhaenyra insisted she was in love with her uncle and pleaded with her father for leave to marry him. Viserys would not hear of it and reminded his daughter that Daemon already had a wife. In his anger, he confined Rhaenyra to her chambers and told his brother to depart, and commanded both of them never to speak of what had happened. Now it's Mushroom's version of the tale that interests us here. According to the dwarf, it was Sir Criston Cole the princess yearned for, not Daemon. But Sir Criston was a true knight, noble, chaste, and mindful of his vows. And though he was in Rhaenyra's company day and night, he had never so much as kissed her, nor made any declaration of his love or intent, which given the sheer age gap, does make a lot of sense. Daemon then took it upon himself to teach Rhaenyra how to seduce Criston, with what Mushroom calls kissing lessons, and trips to the streets of Silk. Mushroom is firm that Rhaenyra remained a maiden, as she wanted to preserve her innocence for Criston. But when at last she approached Criston, using all the skills Daemon had taught her, Criston was horrified and spurned her. The whole tale soon came out, in no part thanks to Mushroom himself. King Viserys at first, much like the tale as told by Eustace, refused to believe a word of it, until Daemon confirmed it was true. All this would lead to the marriage pact with House Velaryon, and Daemon once again exiled. When he looks at you, he sees the little girl you were, not the woman you have become. But I can teach you how to make him see you as a woman. Daemon Targaryen to Rhaenyra Targaryen, according to Mushroom. Fire and blood, heirs of the dragon. A question of succession. Okay, so what's important here is we have one account of Rhaenyra and Criston having any kind of romantic relationship. That account coming from Mushroom, not exactly the most trustworthy source. However, while the parts of the tale that involve Daemon are typically quite scandalous, which is often Mushroom's motive, he does paint Criston Cole in a more positive light as a true knight, which could be telling given how Mushroom paints other key characters and their motivations in other stories. While I don't think the show should be seen as any indication of what is or is not true to the book, it is clear that the relationship between Criston and Rhaenyra and Daemon's role in the tale, as told by Mushroom, is certainly an inspiration for what they did in House of the Dragon, with the key difference being Criston does succumb to Rhaenyra's advances. But so far, in the context of the book, according to Mushroom at least, Criston Cole seems like a noble knight who takes his Kingsguard vows very seriously. Now we get to the point where we tread into the grey area of Criston Cole, his character and his motivations, and what led him to becoming the Kingmaker. As we well know, Rhaenyra was not thrilled at the prospect of a marriage to Rhaenyra Velaryon, as it's not someone she would have realistically chosen to marry herself. But after Viserys threatens to name Aegon his heir, she did consent to the match. It is now, however, that our sources drastically differ. It is said that that very night after Rhaenyra had agreed to the match, certain Eustace reported Sir Criston Cole slipped into the princess's bedchamber to confess his love for her. He told Rhaenyra that he had a ship waiting on the bay and begged her to flee with him across the narrow sea. They would be wed in Tyrosh or Volantis, where her father's writ did not run, and no one would care that Sir Criston had betrayed his vows as a member of the Kingsguard. His prowess as a fighter meant there was no doubt he could find some merchant prince to take him into his service, or failing that, to join a sellsword company. But Rhaenyra refused him. She was the blood of the dragon, she reminded him, and was meant for more than to live out her life as the wife of a common sellsword. If he could set aside his Kingsguard vows, why would marriage vows mean any more to him? The full Mushroom tells a very different tale. In his version, it was Princess Rhaenyra who went to Criston, not him to her. She found Criston alone in the White Sword Tower, barred the door, and slipped off her cloak to reveal herself naked underneath, offering Sir Criston her maidenhead, in the hopes that if her future husband found out, he would not want her. But it all would fall on deaf ears, as Criston Cole was a man of honour, and true to his Kingsguard vows. Even when Rhaenyra used the arts she had learnt from her uncle Daemon, Criston was not to be swayed. Scorned and furious, the princess swept out into the night, where she chanced to encounter Sir Harwin Strong, coming back from a night of revelry in the stews of the city. Harwin had long desired the princess and lacked Sir Criston's scruples. It was he who took Rhaenyra's innocence, according to Mushroom, who claims to have found them in bed at the break of day. Now, we have no way of knowing what version of this tale is true, but whatever one it is, does drastically change the motivations of Criston Cole in fully joining the Greens and why he would back Aegon. Regardless of whom scorned who, from that night on Sir Criston Cole and Rhaenyra despised one another, and any love or affection between them was dead. Cole became one of her most bitter detractors and enemies. Both versions of this tale are plausible and could very well have happened. Set in Eustace's version is very detailed when it comes to who said what and did what, from Criston's motivations and plan to Rhaenyra's cold and brutal response. But my issue with Eustace's tale is where exactly did he get such detailed information of the events from, and from who? I highly doubt Criston Cole pulled Eustace aside and told him every detail of his treacherous plan. But here's the thing that gives Eustace's tale a little bit more credibility. He was not a fan or supporter of Rhaenyra. He was very much one of the Greens. This fact alone might give us an idea of how he came about this tale. He may have got some of it from Cole himself, maybe other parts from other members of the Greens, such as Alicent Hightower. Given that Eustace is against Rhaenyra, why would he create a version of a tale that makes Criston look frankly awful, making Rhaenyra look better and more politically savvy and calculated, making the correct choice? None of this really fits, unless maybe elements of Eustace's account is in fact true, but not necessarily all of it. The version of Criston Cole this creates is an angered and bitter rejected fallen knight, with this being core to his motivations going forward. Mushroom's version of the tale lacks the hard detail Eustace's does, which does fit the rest of his accounts, and how he personally comes across his information, whispers and rumours. What does stand out about Mushroom's version is that it is consistent with his earlier testimonies. For example, it once again being Criston Cole who spurns Rhaenyra's advances, and again Cole being resolute. Another aspect to consider with Mushroom's version of the tale is that Rhaenyra then went to Harwin strong. This is important for many reasons, but mainly because it does fit with events that happen after her marriage to Laenor, with Harwin becoming her sworn shield, and the idea he's the father of Rhaenyra's sons. But we must also recall the source here is Mushroom, a man who embellishes his stories greatly for entertainment value. It would not surprise me if he retroactively added the Harwin strong aspect to his tale after the rumours of Rhaenyra's affair with Harwin came to the surface. Also ponder this as well. While not what I would call an official member of the Blacks or a true supporter of Rhaenyra, he was her fool. He was present and at many of these events, and was a key part of her court in the build-up and during the Dance of the Dragons. Even if his tales are, as we say, embellished, it is possible he was privy to a lot of information and stories others were not. After all, who would pay attention to the fool when discussing these kinds of matters? This is why it's so hard to figure out what version is the truth. Both versions are plausible, and both sources in Eustace and Mushroom had their own positive aspects and negative that make them both simultaneously good but also questionable sources. What I find interesting with the approach House the Dragon has taken with these differing sources when it comes to Rhaenyra and Criston is it seems to have taken aspects of each tale and created a single narrative taking cues from both Eustace and Mushroom. While I do question a lot of the creative choices House the Dragon made with the source material, when it comes to this specific instance, I think they did a decent job of unifying the different versions of events. Sadly, this cannot be said for many of the other instances where the show had to interpret the source material. What we can say is that after this event, Criston Cole is firmly in the Green camp alongside Alicent Hightower, Rhaenyra's direct rival, who is now his patron. Given the context of these two tales, it seems Criston's motivation is coming from either being rejected so harshly by Rhaenyra, or being the pious Kingsguard knight, disgusted by what he sees as Rhaenyra's wanton behaviour. In either case, Criston's new affiliation with the Greens would lead him to seeing Aegon as Viserys' heir. You can see how deeply this event, no matter what version is true, affects Criston, from his actions at the wedding tourney of Rhaenyra and Laenor in 114 AC. He faces Harwin strong in single combat, and left him with several broken bones, then going on to kill Laenor's favourite Joffrey Lonmouth in a duel. By all accounts, Criston fought with a fury and a purpose, the only kind a personal grievance gives a man. Over the next decade, this disdain for Rhaenyra only seemed to deepen. All the while, Criston became an even more important part of the Green faction, not only being the sworn shield of Queen Alicent, but training her sons Aegon, Aemond and Daeron in combat, with his position as Lord Commander giving him a seat on the Small Council, and thus close connections with the other collaborators that were part of the Green faction. We don't really know that much about what Criston did in the years between 114 and Viserys' death in 129 AC, other than those few details. So when House of the Dragon came to adapt this time period, they chose to really show the utter disdain Cole now has for Rhaenyra, not just in his attitude, but the language he uses to describe her. The show does make it a little bit more complex by developing his deep loyalty and relationship with Alicent, with that stemming from their mutual dislike of Rhaenyra, as both feeling they were wronged in different ways by her, with Alicent going as far as saving Criston's life when he tried to kill himself in the wake of Rhaenyra's wedding feast and his killing of Joffrey Longmouth. The show gives the viewer much more of a reason to believe why Criston is now so anti-Rhaenyra with this new dynamic with Alicent. I'm not going to comment on where this relationship goes in Season 2, as that's a matter for a whole separate video, but in the context of Season 1 on its own, I think it worked really well, and is a better example of the show fleshing out a character and their backstory. So why is Criston Cole remembered as the Kingmaker, and not all this other drama that came before it? Did he really deserve that title? And given that, why did the show play down his role in that very kingmaking? The first Viserys intended his daughter Rhaenyra to follow him. Do you deny it? But as the king lay dying, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard decided it should be otherwise. Arianne Martell to Aris Oakheart, A Feast for Crows Chapter 13, The Soiled Knight. When Viserys dies in 129 AC, it's clear that the Greens have been planning how to react for a long time, effectively locking down the Red Keep. What is very telling is it's Criston Cole that Alicent brings into Viserys' bedchamber to confirm his death. To me, this indicates just how much of a Green Criston now is. His role after Viserys' death is actually very important, especially in locking down the Red Keep and preventing news of Viserys' death from spreading. In doing so, it gave the Greens enough time to act without opposition and install Aegon as king before Rhaenyra, or really anyone from the Blacks, could react. Without a man such as Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, on side, it may not have been possible to keep the death of Viserys under wraps for the better part of several days. During the meeting of the Green Council itself, Criston is very much an active part of it, when arguing as to why they should crown Aegon over Rhaenyra. In fact, his comments regarding Rhaenyra again shows us as the reader just how personal this conflict is for Criston, be that on a moral level or simply a rejected and bitter ex-lover. He argues that Jaehaerys Velaryon would rule after Rhaenyra, saying, "Seven saved the realm if we seat a bastard on the Iron Throne." He also spoke of Rhaenyra's wanton ways and the infamy of her husband, Laenor, stating, "They will turn the Red Keep into a brothel. No man's daughter will be safe, nor any man's wife, even the boys." We have multiple accounts of the death of Lyman Beesbury, the only council member to dissent and back Rhaenyra, potentially killed by the hands of Sir Criston Cole. Grandmaster Orwell tells us that Lord Beesbury was seized at the door by the command of Sir Otto Hightower and simply escorted to the dungeons, confined to a black cell, where in time he would perish of a chill while awaiting trial. Lyman dying in captivity has very little to do with Sir Criston in this case. Septon Eustace tells us in his account, Sir Criston forced Beesbury back into his seat and opened his throat with a dagger. Mushroom also accuses Sir Criston with the death of Lord Beesbury, but in this version, Cole grasped the old man by the back of his collar and threw him out of a window to die impaled upon the iron spikes in the dry moat below. It's hard to really know what version of this tale is true, but given that both Eustace and Orwell are Greens, their version to me does hold slightly more weight. Especially Orwell, given he was the only source present at the Green Council meeting, and I don't see any reason as to why he would lie about what happened when his testimony is being written. The reason I find Mushroom's tale suspect is he was not even in King's Landing when any of this happened, and he's basing his claim on the second-hand accounts of people whom were not even present. I was very disappointed with how House of the Dragon adapted the Green Council scenes. is one of my favourite parts of Fire and Blood, but the approach the show took and sheer lack of time it spent on it gave us a really pale and watered down version that lacks the political intrigue of the books. I do like how they handle Beesbury's death though, taking cues from the account of Maester Orwell in terms of Criston being responsible, but making the killing slightly more accidental. What we as readers take away from the Green Council is not just how long this has all been planned for, but just how important Criston is in executing the Green's plan. How outside of Alicent and Otto, he seems to be the most loyal and trusted member, being given such an important role in not just the meetings or the locking down of the Red Keep, but being given the vital task of finding Aegon, the very thing that will become his lasting legacy. So the Kingsguard, including Sir Criston, were sent into the city to find Aegon and bring both him and Aemond to the Green Council. As we know, Aemond was easily found, Aegon not so much, as he'd ventured into the city for a night of revelry with his favourites. We don't know if it was Criston who was given the specific task of finding Aegon, or the Kingsguard in general, but it makes sense as a trusted member of the Greens and Lord Commander, he be the one to fetch the new king. How Criston found Aegon, we don't know, but he was found drinking. Mushrooms suggest he was in fact in Flea Bottom in the child fighting pit with a young girl pleasuring him. Eustace, on the other hand, says that Aegon was with a paramour when he was found by Criston, and he insists that the girl was the daughter of a wealthy trader and well cared for. It is Eustace that suggests that at first, Aegon refused to be a part of his mother's plan. To quote Fire and Blood, "My sister is the heir, not me. What sort of brother steals his sister's birthright?" It's only when Sir Criston convinced him that Rhaenyra must surely execute him and his brothers should she take the crown. Aegon wavered. While any true-born Targaryen yet lives, no strong can ever hope to sit the Iron Throne. Rhaenyra has no choice but to take your heads if she wishes her bastards to rule after her, Cole said. It was this, and only this, that persuaded Aegon to accept the crown that the small council was offering him. The first thing to remember about both of these accounts is neither Mushroom or Eustace were present, but they could both be plausible, and one has much more detail than the other. Whilst Eustace was not there in the room, he was closely involved with the plot to crown Aegon, so very easily could have heard this information secondhand. Mushroom, once again, was not present in King's Landing, and very much part of Rhaenyra's court at this time. He would have heard about these events he's claiming to have knowledge of years after they happened, from second, maybe even third-hand sources. I do think it's possible that in some ways, both of these versions of the tale can be true to differing extents. It is possible that Aegon was at some point that night in the fighting pits, before later being found by Sir Criston with his paramour, where he convinced him to claim the crown. In terms of what actually was said between Cole and Aegon, I'm not taking Eustace's account at face value. I think it's highly likely that Criston had convinced Aegon to claim it, but we can never know if these were the exact words that passed between them. However, if Criston did in fact say these things, he is correct in the assumption that at this stage Rhaenyra cannot allow Aegon or his brothers to live. They've already crossed the Rubicon, and it's too late to go back. But what makes me believe Criston could have said some of these things to this effect is his comment about Rhaenyra's children, as it really fits with what we know of his character at this point and his prior relationship with Rhaenyra, possibly being that bitter ex-lover or pious knight. House of the Dragon seems to favour Mushroom's account of Criston's kingmaking, and that Aegon had been to a child fighting pit, with Aemond, not Criston, finding him drunk in a sept. It is then Aemond who convinces his brother that he needs to claim the crown, and not Criston, which really does take away from Criston's whole character of the Kingmaker. But this is one of those changes, like with a lot of the way the Green Council was done, I really do not like. But if I had to play devil's advocate and put my screenwriting hat on for a second, I would argue they chose this path because they have already spent near 9 episodes developing Criston Cole as a character and his relationship with Rhaenyra, Alicent and her children. His motives are very clear at this stage. This is only really our 2nd or 3rd episode with a fully grown adult Aemon. Viewers are still kind of getting to know him, so by giving him a more active role here in crowning Aegon is a good way to help the viewers learn more about his character and his relationship with Aegon at this stage. While I think when characters such as Jaime Lannister and Arianne Martell think of Criston being the Kingmaker, they think of him finding and convincing Aegon to take the crown. But there is another way you could look at it, an event we are certain did happen, and that is the fact that at Aegon's coronation, it was Criston Cole who placed the crown on Aegon's head, not the High Septon, not his mother. Out of everyone it could have been, it was Criston Cole. So even if you don't believe the accounts of Eustace or Mushroom, this very act by definition still makes Criston the Kingmaker. Trying to piece together who Criston Cole is as a character and what motivated him, as we have seen, is extremely challenging with the nature of Fire and Blood. You have either a jilted ex-lover whose bitterness and resentment ran so deep he joined a faction working against Rhaenyra and becoming a key figure in getting Aegon II on the throne, or you have this pious Kingsguard knight who finds Rhaenyra's behaviour reprehensible and wanton, who's disgusted at the idea of her apparent bastard children inheriting the Iron Throne. Both these motivations are very different, but do lead to the same tangible conclusion. Criston becomes a key member of the Greens, and extremely anti-Rhaenyra. I personally am not sure what version I believe. I think with the context of who our sources of information are, Eustace, Mushroom and Orwell, the testimonies of Eustace and Orwell do paint a more realistic picture of who Criston Cole could be, given that they were physically present in King's Landing. But we shouldn't disregard Mushroom's testimony entirely, because it could also be correct in some capacity. It can be hard to look through the embellishments to find that nugget of truth. The main issue we have with his account is for a lot of it he was on the other side of Blackwater Bay, opposed to the accounts of men who were really there. But then, what makes this even trickier is while most view Mushroom as pro-Rhaenyra, in some of his accounts the fall is actually quite favourable to Criston. I think the most logical answer to this is the truth is somewhere in that muddy grey area in between. Elements to some degree of each account are likely true, but it makes it really impossible to conclusively say which. But in the end, no matter what one is true, it all leads to the same place: Criston Cole forever being known as the Kingmaker.